Good morning. Before we begin today's session, I'd like to acknowledge that our conversation is being held virtually on the lands of the Kulin Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge them as traditional owners. I'd also like to pay my respect to their elders past and present, and Aboriginal elders of other communities who may be here today. I'm dialing in from Wurundjeri and Boomerang Land. I'm Melissa Bianca-Amore, the lead curator for the Conversation series, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the Melbourne Art Fair Conversation series. We are delighted to present the lead headline interview with Professor Marcia Langton AM, art writer and curator, anthropologist and geographer, and Dr. Brook Andrew, interdisciplinary artist, writer and artistic director of the 22nd Biennale of Sydney. It is my pleasure to welcome Erik Jensen to moderate this panel. Erik is the founding editor of the Saturday paper and editor-in-chief of Swartz Media. He is the author of the award-winning biography Acute Misfortune, The Life and Death of Adam Cullum, for which he also wrote a feature film adaptation. His other work includes the book on Kate Jennings, quarterly essay titled The Prosperity Gospel, and poetry collection I Said the Sea Was Folded. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the Melbourne Art Fair, and I wish you a beautiful conversation, and I look forward to listening. Thank you all.
Thanks so much. I join in welcoming Brook and Marcia. Professor Marcia Langton is an anthropologist and geographer, and since 2000 has been the foundation chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. She's produced a large body of knowledge in the areas of political and legal anthropology, Indigenous agreements and engagement, and Indigenous culture and art. And she has been a recent member of the expert panel on constitutional recognition. Professor Langton is known for her policy commitment and impact alongside her role as a prominent public intellectual. Since 1993, she has been a member of the Order of Australia in recognition of her work in anthropology and the advocacy of Indigenous rights. And since 2016, she has been honoured as the University of Melbourne Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor. In further recognition of her key role in public life, she has been since 2017 Associate Provost at the University of Melbourne. Marcia, thanks so much for joining this conversation today.
Thanks, Erik.
And equally excited to welcome Brook Andrew to this conversation. Brook is a Wiradjuri artist, writer, curator, and now theatre maker. His interdisciplinary practice is driven by the collisions of intertwined narratives grounded in his perspective as a Wiradjuri and Celtic person. Brook's artworks, research, leadership roles, and curatorial projects challenge the limitations imposed by power structures, historical amnesia, and complicity. He is also a professor. He is Enterprise Professor of Interdisciplinary Practice and Director of Reimagining Museums and Collections at the University of Melbourne. And he is known to many of us as an artist, increasingly also as a curator. And it is the relationship between these two modes that I'm interested in focusing on in today's conversation. So Brook, thanks so much for joining today.
Yama, and hello everyone out there. It's good to be here.
Broadly, I hope that this will be a conversation that looks at art as it relates to your own works, as an anthropologist who is working as a curator and as a visual artist who is curating significant shows beyond your own practice now, Brook. I think an interesting place to start might be a work that you've made recently, Brook, that Marcia has also seen. It's a theatre work called Gaban. And I'm wondering if you could start by talking to us a bit about what that work is and what you're doing in that work, because I think it will form something like a fulcrum between the two big projects you're both working on.
Sure, yeah, no, thanks for that. So Gaban means strange in Wiradjuri, which is the language of my mother's family, Western New South Wales. And it really kind of culminated in many years of being in this really complicated space. I call it the colonial wubba. Wubba means whole, so it's like a vortex of, the kind of things and spaces that we're in, these kind of complex museum spaces around cultural material, around repatriation, around reparation, working also internationally in this space, working collaboratively with my own and other communities in this space, and it's messy. As an interdisciplinary artist, it's a funny word, but like I was kind of grappling about what to do. So I really found it in the theatre space. I'm not a traditional theatre person. I'm not going to claim to be a theatre person, but I was very lucky to work with Buddy Miller at the Victorian College of the Arts and third year master's students last year to present the play and to work at the language. And some of the I'm working with Annie Carolyn and Tiriki Onus and others to really push forward this kind of messy space. And so some of the characters' names are massacre, guilt, museum, judge, witness, time, evidence, memory, tree, photo. So they represent the establishment of museums and the things that, also public, that kind of corral around it, but also the objects or powerful objects, as I call them. And really my aim is to kind of, how do we get to healing? How do we get to that kind of really that space we want without lateral violence, without racism, without expectations, without all the kind of, things that we're supposed to be and do in a place that is often from other people's imagination or positioning. And so really this is kind of the exercise. And so to have that platform, Marcia also saw the play, and also Wesley Enoch really helped and supported me earlier on, and Pascal, Dantos Berry, Eleni Arbus, a whole bunch of other people kind of on that journey. And eventually it will be, shown in Berlin later on in the year, working with, other international people.
I'm interested, I guess, also in the fact that theatre became the place where you ended up making that work or trying to express those ideas. Obviously, you're both people who work across multiple formats. Was there a reason that work found itself in theatre? Were you working somewhere else and then discovered that it actually was theatre that you were making?
Yeah, I mean, being in the museum space, and I'm sure Marcia will reflect on this in what we're about to talk to too, and also working with those collections also reflecting on our own lives. There's this immense intergenerational trauma. It's a real thing. And when we work in those spaces and our communities sometimes have similar ideas or different ideas and people change their mind, it's a very vulnerable space. It's also a very complicated one that's not necessarily fixed. And when you've got a national government or a national view, regardless if it's from the public consciousness or somewhere else, when are we in our own spaces? When can I actually be who I am with my family and be safe? And so that's where I found that place. I found that place within creating a theatre piece where I was not shackled to even international views of what is decolonial, for example, or how I'm supposed to be in that space.
Marcia, you saw that work and we're about to talk about a project that you're working on, but could you tell me a little bit about the experience of seeing Brooke's theatre work and the ideas that come from it?
Yeah, Erik, Gabon does the work that occurs well, let me put it this way, that Indigenous people have to do whenever they enter a museum or a gallery that purports to present Indigenous art in a way that is not a part of Indigenous traditions. Now, not even Indigenous art, but, say artifacts, stone tools, axes, photographs of people, anything that's exhibited in the colonial or post-colonial style to represent something about Indigenous people is well, I'll put it this way, it's enemy territory for Indigenous people. I've been going to museums since I was a kid. I was born in Brisbane and lived in Brisbane in several parts of my life. And I can remember going to the Queensland Museum. And it was back then an absolute horror show. There were mummified bodies and skulls hanging on strings and dead animals. And it was absolutely terrifying as a child. And everything in it, apart from the, botanical and, natural science exhibitions, everything else was Aboriginal, Papua New Guinean, Pacific. And it was, honest to God, a horror show. And so many museums are still like that. The Pitt Rivers Museum, for instance, they're bound by the will of Pitt Rivers himself to show it exactly as he wanted. So what happens to an Indigenous person when you go into a museum or gallery and you see, for instance, the works made by your own ancestors, and they're presented as, say, primitive or a type of tool? Well, you see, you get multiple voices. So there's the colonial voice or the post-colonial voice. It might be a 20th century or even a 21st century anthropologist presenting this to us, a white anthropologist, or it might be, an old colonial museum director who had particularly weird ideas about races, the pyramid of races with the white race at the top of the pyramid. So you get all of those voices speaking through these museum exhibitions. And then what I see and hear are the very faint voices of the Indigenous people who went before me, who have been represented in this way. And there's a lot of that kind of multivalence in Brooke's work, and I've written about it before. And I've talked about, for instance, in relation to Gunmetal Grey, a series of works that Brooke made some years ago, I talk about ghostscapes. And, the big problem is, how do we as Indigenous people reinstate the humanity and dignity of all of these anonymous people represented in photographs, represented in stone tools, represented in any museum exhibition? You might note that, by and large, there are no names. People don't have names. Their names are taken away from them. They're stripped of their identity. They're stripped of their cultural identity, and all brought under the rubric of Indigenous or Aboriginal or primitive. There's no specificity. This is why Brooke uses language. And this is why the play is called Gaban. There is a language that was spoken by Brooke's ancestors. So, this is very difficult to explain to non-Indigenous people, that we don't hear just the colonial voice. We also hear the voices of our ancestors. And it is our duty, in a way, working with cultural heritage collections or working with art as we do, to bring those voices of our own peoples to the fore, truthfully and with dignity and with integrity.
Brooke, Marcia said at the beginning of that your play does the work that an Indigenous person has to do when they go into a museum space. Did you know that that's consciously what the play was doing? Was that the driving force, that you were making explicit work that is hidden?
Can I just say first, Erik, Brooke told me nothing much about his play at all, except that he was writing one and that he was doing it with Buddy Miller. And what I have to say, all my own thoughts after seeing the play, I was not allowed to know anything about the play. So,
Brooke, did you want to pick up on that idea?
Yeah, no, I think it's I mean, I suppose that was the great thing about working with the VCA and the students and everything. That's another kind of other whole lot of issues around language, etc. But yeah, no one really knew what the play was about when they saw it. But for me, it was about creating a healing space, a space where I felt safe. And I think that this is, like I mentioned, lateral violence before. There are a few other Indigenous people out there who are mean and who are horrendous deliberately to other people, and probably because of their own trauma or their own dislocation, or the fact that everyone's got skin in the game, literal skin in the game. So it's not even about saying who's right or who's wrong. It's about that it is a difficult space to be in. And so for me to create characters called, Mararagulani, which is the tree, it's the carved tree, and that carved tree, its character, it self-harms. And it's, and that's set in an asylum. And the museum is the asylum. And there's a character called Evidence, which is actually a skull. It's been informed by a skull. And it's interesting how Marcia mentioned the Pitt Rivers Museum, because the Mararagalani, the tree, is actually based on the Wiradjuri Gamilaroi tree section. Like it's inspired by that. And the character Massacre is inspired by an 1854 letter by James Dixon in the Snowy River in Victoria, describing a massacre that he took place in. And so for me to create this world was a way that I could kind of position and negotiate without all that external trauma, where I could be playful in a space, and not playful in a necessarily a good way either, but I have found humor in it as well. I have found other ways to find things or to work through things that you can't do in those spaces in real life or in real time.
I wonder if from there, Marcia, we might go to talking about a major show that you've been working on, 65,000 Years, A Short History of Australian Art. Because I suspect some of these ideas are picked up in that exhibition. But are you able, Marcia, to talk a little bit about what that show will be and what work you're doing with it?
Yeah, thanks, Erik. So it opens at the Ian Potter Museum of Art at the University of Melbourne in July 2023. The museum is being renovated, and this exhibition is the work of, again, like Brooke's work, the work of a big team. So I'm co-curating with Shanisa McConville and Judith Ryan. Also many staff from the University of Melbourne, both in our museums and collections division and also across our faculties. So we have a moving feast, if you like, with a curatorium, and people pop in and out of the curatorium that I set up some years ago to bring expertise to this exercise. And so Brooke has been a member of that curatorium when he's in the country. The original brief, if you like, came from the chair of our Ian Potter Museum of Art. And he asked me to consider doing an exhibition or curating an exhibition of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collections of the University of Melbourne, which are vast and wonderful and have rarely been shown. So I worked my way through some of the collections, the rare book room, the print room, and so on with colleagues. And look, first of all, we do have amazing collections. And they reflect the work of individuals who've been at the University of Melbourne over the past 160 something years. But, it reflects their particular interests. And so it's not a seamless history. There are big gaps. In one collection, there'll be an emphasis on bark paintings from Arnhem Land, photographs from Northern Australia and in another collection, it'll be a hodgepodge of works collected by a collector from across Australia and the Pacific. And so it's very difficult to make sense of such an enormous collection. And I want, in calling it 65,000 years, a short history of Australian art, to show how profound Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders' design traditions are in telling so many stories about people, about ancestors, about places, about the environment. And so what Shanisa, Judith and I have been able to do with our wonderful friends at the University of Melbourne is design a show that will take the visitor on a journey through places and history, environments, events. So, in each of the, say, people call them traditional works, and, it's a misnomer really, because, say, for instance, you could have a Coolamon, a person who doesn't know a lot about Aboriginal material culture will say, oh, that's traditional. But what if it were made in 1965? How traditional is it? Especially if it's got, a carving of phar lap on it, for instance, So you come across these wonderful objects in museum collections that have a, material culture base that, might be 10,000 years old, and yet there'll be a pictogram or some kind of representative motif that talks about very modern events. So we've taken a huge variety of art forms and genre and regions to tell a very complicated story. And we're borrowing works. So we're going to collectors and museums and galleries to borrow works to fill in the gaps. So we have, for instance, some wonderful works from the East Kimberley, from that, tradition in the East Kimberley that arose out of, or let's call it a genre that arose out of life at what was Turkey Creek, now Warraman, in the East Kimberley, when people were coming in from the desert and from other communities to this settlement. It was originally a ration depot. And this is where ceremonies were held, regional ceremonies. And the paintings from those ceremonies formed the basis of a new art movement, which you can see in the works of the late Paddy Bedford or the late Rusty Peters. So, there were very interesting stories to tell about each regional genre. But we don't have, say, a Robert Thomas, so we'll have to borrow a Robert Thomas. In relation to the Central Desert, we have some beautiful Emily Ngware works. The late Emily Ngware was very old when she started painting, and she really, along with Robert Thomas who was originally from the Canning Stock route and ended up in Warraman, these two artists changed the global view of Aboriginal art when their works sold for enormous amounts of money at auction in a secondary sale. So they just changed the whole world, and they became world famous. And people overseas started paying attention to these very regional styles. And, you have huge collections in Europe and the United States of America. In fact, some of our works are being borrowed to tour in an exhibition being curated by Jumbawa Marawili and his colleagues in the United States. Works by him, in fact. So there's a lot to talk about, and I think I should stop there for the moment.
I'm interested, Brooke said something just before about healing in a museum context. Do you think that's something that is possible, and is it something that putting together not revisionist, but a more directed history of Australian art in this context can do? Do you think there is the possibility of healing in a museum context?
You know, once upon a time, and I forget when this changed, Erik, the Art Gallery of New South Wales had all of the Aboriginal works downstairs in a kind of basement in what was literally called, this is what the sign said over the staircase, the Primitive Gallery or Primitive Art. That's no longer the case, of course, but I went down there when it was still called the Primitive Art Gallery. And now, you know, there are magnificent Aboriginal works on the main floor, as you know, regularly. So the world has changed for Aboriginal people in terms of going into a museum in the last 30 years, a museum or a major gallery. So in the last 30 years, there's been a revolution. And, you know, I have to say, I'm very disappointed with a lot of the art criticism. There's some, you know, great scholarly takes and, you know, for instance, Vanessa Russ and Ian McLean, who supervised her thesis on the Art Gallery of New South Wales. But if you only read the art criticism, you really wouldn't have a clue. You know, it's nice, it's pretty, and, you know, it says a few things about the art, but there's so much to know. And so what I love about this exercise is the ability that I have at the University of Melbourne to bring in colleagues. Academic freedom really counts for something, Erik. Let me tell you. So I'm asking particular Indigenous people to co-curate rooms or areas in the galleries with me, to bring that Indigenous sensibility and depth of knowledge about works to the exercise. And, you know, it might have to do with a soundtrack or a plaque or which works are hung together and, you know, what history we're going to tell about those works. So I am very concerned to hear the Indigenous voice. Judith is a co-curator, and, you know, she has an extraordinary knowledge from her many years, decades even, at the National Gallery of Victoria, and her contribution to putting together their Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander collection and exhibiting it over many years. And so there is a place for scholarship of the type that Judith has, but we cannot allow anymore only one voice. We must have multiple voices. So there's the scholar's voice, but the Indigenous voice brings out the meanings, the emotions, it's the Indigenous voice that truly illuminates the work. And that's what I'm hoping that we achieve in 65,000 years.
I think that's a really good place to turn to talking about the show that you're working on, Brooke, at Martin-Gropius-Bau in Berlin. This is a show, I don't know if it's titled Care, Repair and Healing, or its title may change, I'm not sure, but if you could talk about that, because I think that picks up the same thread that Marcia is talking about, the multiplicity of voices and the need for certain voices to give meaning.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the ambition around what Marcia and colleagues and friends and communities are all working together. I mean, you know, one thing that Marcia hasn't talked about is, you know, the extensive work in which, you know, the people she's talking about and further are actually working and have been working very closely with grassroots communities with relation to those collections. So it's not just this kind of, okay, what you see on display. And I think that's probably what, Marcia, what you're talking about when it comes to art criticism, you know, or generally and the scholarly, but, you know, it's often you just got to go a little bit further in the shadow area, and there's like this really huge excitement for communities and people working with them. And, you know, there is this joy which is so essential, to actually, this is, this is such a contagious, like in a positive way, space to be in, because the other side of all of this that we're talking about is this, oh, we get to see this now. We get to have a say in this now. Oh, it can inspire me, it can inspire my son. I've got a 14-year-old son. We all have different connections to what this means. And so the expansiveness of the proposition of calling something 65,000 years of Australian art is really provocative and amazing. And the same with the working title, Care, Repair and Healing, working with, people probably know these names anyway, but working with, Stephanie Rosenthal, who actually did the Sydney Biennale before Mami Katioka, Kader Attia, the incredible Algerian artist, Barbara Rodriguez Munoz, who used to work at the Wellcome Trust in London and is now back in South America, and also Seraphine 1369, Jamila Johnson Small, who's a performance artist. Really, when this was conceived, it was really a show that Kader wanted to do with Stephanie. And then, because he's now doing the Berlin Biennale, which I'm super excited about, seeing him, another artist, doing something like that in the way in which the artist can work in that space, he really opened it up to the world. And we've had huge conversations and dilemmas about what the hell do we call this? And I think the question you're asking me is about change. How do we initial change? Do we want something different? We do. I think a lot of us do want something different. We don't want to be cornered in a space and not be able to shift or move, because I think that's dangerous, and not in a good way. It makes people sick, or people make themselves sick. And so the title is going to be something else. And it's interesting you asked me about the title too, because we wanted to have a kind of a gathering, and we had this gathering called Amma, 4 days on caring, repair and healing, which happened, between the 4th and 7th of November last year at the Gropius-Bau, Martin-Gropius-Bau. And it was kind of like a way for us to share and bring in speakers and have, talks and performances about how are we actually in this space? How can the Martin-Gropius-Bau and its historical legacy even be in this space? How can that institute be in this space? How can we be in that space? How can we work together? And of course, we don't always agree, but at least we're in an amicable space, and I return again to the things around lateral violence, or the things where people are espousing to other people. That's not a kind of space that I'm interested in. I'm interested in spaces that people want to be in, and they want to work through the shit. They want to work through this colonial wobber, this vortex, and create a better place. And I'm not saying that to be airy-fairy. I'm not naive. I see things, possibilities. And I think that freshness is a really exciting space to be in. So this exhibition, it's growing. We're kind of thinking about, okay, how do we include animals into this space, because it is so incredibly human-centric as well. But how is it that we bring in incredible people like, the Ngangkari healer Betty Mufflin, who's also an extraordinary painter, and her, collaborator Marinka. They're, also working with many other artists that I don't think I can talk about now. But bringing it back to your question, I think that both, 65,000 years and also this exhibition, they're ambitious, and I think that they need to challenge past, Western art canonized exhibitions. Even there was a show by the past director of the Musée d'Iki, Brian Lee-Yves Lefeur, who did a show called Picasso Primitive, and I like Eve, I've gone on with Eve, but I was very complicated. And, it was complicated, and I was confounded why there was a picture of, a Picasso of a man and a woman laying in bed post or pre-sex. And then you had a bark painting from the Northern Territory that had two, spirit figures with, breasts and a penis. And I was confounded. Like, what does that actually mean? And so I think that there is a lot more room and space, as Marcia said, where people are doing this. The Wellcome Trust are doing it. I know that MUSPA and Sao Paulo are opening up. They've finally got their first Indigenous curator last year. So yeah, watch this space. And I think that people want something different.
I agree with that. Peter Jopling, the chair of our Ian Potter Museum, asked me this actually during an an exhibition of works by Trevor Nichols at the Ian Potter Museum some years ago. And, you know, what Ian, I think, is very aware of, what Peter Jopling is very aware of, is that our extraordinary collections have been buried in, you know, storage rooms and, you know, various dungeons for decades. People have not seen our work, you know, our collections. And, you know, I think there's a real sense that we're liberating our collections, making them available to the public. There's been this long tradition of scholars hanging on to these collections and keeping them hidden from public view so that they were the only people who could do the interpretations. And about your point about that, you know, Picasso primitive exhibition at the Musée de Quai Branly, there was an intellectual fashion in Paris about 20 years ago. Students in Paris who'd never been to Australia, never met an Aboriginal person, never seen rock art or Aboriginal art, were given images of Aboriginal art and told to interpret it from some kind of what I regard as a pretty dodgy, you know, quasi-psychological point of view, and laid out on this UNESCO book table alongside, you know, your cultural heritage policy booklets, were these honours theses and master's theses about Aboriginal rock art depicting sex, which is simply not the case. The rock art depicts lightning, clouds, ancestors. Well, just because they've got big Buddhas doesn't mean that they're having sex. They just have big Buddhas. It's not about sex. They didn't wear clothes. As I said to some Native Americans who visited here once who asked why I wasn't wearing my traditional dress, I said, because it's a piece of string. You know, so like in Paris, this is what they were doing. And there were mountains of these idiotic theses. And I had to say to some of my colleagues, you know, this is grossly insulting. You must never allow any of these theses to be translated into English and sent to Australia, especially if it's got your name on it, because you won't last long if the traditional owners see this nonsense. Yeah, you know, it's like the wooden sculptures in the Sarawak Museum. They all had penises, and one of our Australian anthropologists from the ANU ran amok in the 1960s with a machete and went through and cut them all off because he found it offensive. And he's an anthropologist. So the idea that, you know, people might have body parts showing before the British came along and made everybody wear clothes, you know, they don't quite get it. There's this disassociation between them and their standards and a completely different society. It's absolutely horrifying, the interpretations of Aboriginal art, just horrifying. This is why our voices are so important.
For all of that, Marcia, and I think you and Brooke are talking about the way in which museums have often, you know, erased or discounted or totally misinterpreted Indigenous work. Does it surprise you that it's within museums that both of you are pursuing this change, or is that the only place that it can happen in terms of a change of understanding?
Well, there are 2 points to be made there, Eric. One is there are societies whose entire cultural heritage was removed by collectors and anthropologists and taken to museums. You could pretty much say that about the Torres Straits, for instance. You know, if Torres Strait Islanders want to see their classical material culture, they have to go to the UK. And it's also true of many of these societies in Australia at the end of the frontier, when so many people had been murdered, people were on the run, people had been forced into settlements. The farmers and the, you know, collectors just, you know, moved through and took everything and put these into collections. So there are collections consisting of hundreds of thousands, millions of items of material culture from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander societies in museums in Australia and around the world. So that's point number one. No, it is no accident that we need to go into these collections and archives. And number two, as I said before, nobody's got a name in these collections. There are no names. Very often you can't find any provenance at all. They were simply stolen. And so we have to, revivify these objects and give them meaning. They're just sitting on shelves in boxes wrapped up in tissue paper. Our heritage has been stolen from us, and we've been locked out of museums for so long. And of course, as I say, that's changed a lot in 30 years. There's so much work to do. So no, it's no accident. And these are the records of our society. Certainly there are written records. I'm not saying that there aren't. But material objects are also records of our past that need to be interpreted.
Brooke, is that similar for you? Is that why you're finding yourself working in museums, working in curation, as well as your own art practice?
You know, it's interesting. I mean, I think that we all have our own personal stories, even as children. And I remember being 13 or 14, it was my biology teacher, not my art teacher. It was my biology teacher who told me that Aboriginal people had swells on their thumbs. And I grew up in the western suburbs of Sydney, you know, football country, you know, lots of Aboriginal, you know, people in sports, you know, big migrant community. We were part of, you know, I was born in, you know, Sydney, grew up in Enmore, Blackett near Blacktown, then the big urban sprawl went out there, and two, you know, very strong connections to country, even though that my grandmother, you know, moved into Sydney for, you know, when the policies changed to assimilation. And, you know, I think it's these kind of stories that many Australians don't understand. And when Marcia talks about the names of things or people in museums, I'm talking about, this is not very long ago. These are policies that affect us people who are living today. And so to reflect on the biology teacher to say to me, oh, only a few Aboriginal people are left in the Central Desert. I went home to Mum, she kind of laughed it off. But I've always been interested in this complex regime that tries to control our cultural identity and the kind of, again, this kind of colonial wubba that I've coined. And I must say that there are incredible caring people who work in museums overseas. And I'm sure that Marcia, you know, has the same experience. In fact, I know that we both know people who are non-Indigenous who work both in Australia and overseas who work tirelessly to make sure that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, or Indigenous people generally, do have access to our cultural materials or our photographs, etc. You know, I think that I'm very interested in, untangling what that mess is. And I do want to say, though, that it is about a level playing field. I think that the terminologies of primitivism and humanity and racism have been incredibly unfortunate. It's a very light word. The way in which that it binds us today, the way in which that it divides us today. And I say this in the context of, for example, you know, the 2018 National Museum in Brazil that burnt down. You know, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Indigenous objects were burnt to the ground. What if that happened to, I don't know, the Victorian and Albert Museum? You know, would people be donating and recreating a museum again to get that back? I think most people probably don't even know about that. What about, you know, the Garden Palace, you know, for example, in Sydney, which is of course based on the Crystal Palace and, you know, in the late 1800s, that also burnt to the ground and in fact had many hundreds of thousands of Indigenous objects from New South Wales in it. So, you know, if we want to talk about museums, let's talk about invisibility. And let's talk about the way in which that what extent do people have an understanding of a level playing field of culture and art, and how can we find joy in that? And you asked the question before to Marcia about how was her show about healing, and she didn't answer it directly to you, because she answered it in a way about how can we put our hands on things to actually open that space without fear. And it is a precarious thing to do. It's new. This is a very new thing, Indigenous people having access to objects and presenting them. And that's why it can be complicated, even for our own communities. But it's so essential to bring along people with that narrative and that story and that collaboration, because the other take on it, which I often talk about with the British Museum and all these museums overseas, the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva, who I also have a close relationship with, Europeans have been living with Indigenous objects for generations. They are the custodians. So of course they're freaking out. They go, all these objects that belong to Indigenous people that apparently don't exist anymore, we own them all now. And like my grandson or grandchild or whatever owns it, and my grandparents, owned it as well. What happens if, that's what that whole fear is around reparations and restitution, repatriation, but who actually owns that cultural material? So what is this mess look like? So that's why we're all in it together. I don't think people can stand back and go, okay, that's their problem. It's like when Marcia talked about the decolonial thing, she doesn't even use that word. I don't use that word. I use Yinjamara Gunana, which means ongoing respect. It just doesn't stop with a policy or a moment of feeling good about something. These are real people, real histories, real powerful things. And I think they deserve the recognition and the visibility.
We have a real problem. There's a movement in Europe called Give It Back. And Brooke and I have emailed each other articles about particular activists who go into museums and point out works that, belong to their own societies, their own people, their own relations. There's a wonderful Nigerian man who's done it. And we don't have a Give It Back movement in Australia because of this terrible problem that so much of the cultural heritage taken from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people sits in museums unprovenanced or uncatalogued, or, the curators are hiding it. Now, Brooke's right. There are many wonderful museum staff and gallery staff who are working with us to overcome this problem, but the problem's just enormous. And which is why I agree with Brooke. We have to return the dignity to these people from the past who were stripped of an identity and stripped of their material culture, stripped of their culture. So, and along with, strengthening languages, rescuing languages, making sure that our languages survive, we also need to make sure that the whole set of philosophies and approaches to life, economic philosophies, kinship philosophies, philosophies about, living in particular environments that are expressed in material culture and art and design also survive. So this is what Brooke means when he says it's complicated. It's very complicated. And more and more Indigenous people are joining this movement in Australia of giving interpretations to work. And that has as much priority as having works repatriated. Certainly repatriation remains very high priority. But once we get them, do we also just, put them into archives and mausoleums and leave these people without names? No, we can't do that. This is important. But the other thing I want to say, and I think this is why you've got us here talking to us. There is something fascinating about Indigenous art that's unique. And I can say of Aboriginal art that much of it is so sublime, beautiful, complex, intriguing, and yet the makers, the artists, the authors are the poorest, most oppressed people on earth. And yet they produce works of extraordinary beauty with great challenges to us as a species, not just to Australians. Australians, you know, haven't yet fully developed a mature response to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander art, design and culture traditions. There's a long way to go before there's a mature response. But, you know, around the world, we have an audience that's growing in sophistication, and here too in Australia. And people are starting to recognise the immense beauty and challenge of Indigenous art and culture.
I think that's a fantastic place to leave the conversation. Marcia and Brooke, it's always a pleasure to speak to both of you. I think this has ended up being a conversation not just about museums as a possible site of healing, but more importantly, a site of dignity and joy, two words that came up over and over. And I think the work that both of you do are allowing for joy and dignity to enter those spaces. So thank you both so much, and thanks for being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Erik.
And then go, Erik.
Thanks,
Thanks, Marcia.